Let's open this up, and Guillaume, maybe I could ask you to kick this off, because in your presentation you really touched upon I think you had a triangle up there, governance, companies, as you called them, private sector, and the food producers, the farmers themselves. So how do you see what Mark presented here, and this is sort of a jump ball, Guillaume, after you weigh in on this, how do you see this influencing those various sectors? What this study has done, the way it breaks it down, the way it focuses, as Mark laid out, both on the technologies and the regions and the way it does it.
Again, I think you have to look at different regions differently, but with regards to I think the OECD countries, we'd be interested actually to have someone presented this report to the membership to see what would be the reaction. But my understanding would be that they would look at that as an opportunity to see if they are on the right track, if they should, perhaps, if there's things they could do to make those technologies that seem to be much more promising move forward. Or
this is at the governance level.
Yeah, exactly. I'm talking about governance. But with regards to the private sectors and farmers, I mean, maybe I'm less qualified to talk about that. But you would hope that those that work on those technologies that are promising will be even encouraged to move further and maybe think about other areas where it would be of higher potential. Maybe they're working on a specific country where they see high potential, but this study shows that in other areas, nitrogen use efficiency or heat tolerance would be at least as important, and therefore we should also look at how could we adapt our technologies in the future to those regions and try to make them available.
So Mark, Guillaume just invited you to OECD to present your study.
I did.
Always good to go to Paris.
Anytime.
And you have, but they have a very short attention span, and you have about 5 minutes with them. What are you going to drive them to?
Again, I think I would emphasize the results of where it helps in those specific countries. And if I was talking to an African forum, it would be a different set of countries. But then I also bring up then the next step issues, and where do you go from here? And there's where I think you need not only, again, it's not as big an issue in OECD, but the infrastructure investments to make sure the rural infrastructure is in place, but also, in particularly, the regulatory environment that was alluded to earlier, that we remove the incentives and disincentives that skew decisions to specific crops or specific technologies that might not be the best, that may cause over-fertilization or an underuse of ecological principles, depending on the case, and to get at improve regulatory biosafety decision making, get rid of unnecessary testing and certification requirements, make it all science-based, so that you create this level playing field, so that the high yield, high return technologies can get a fair shake.
But this is not an argument that has not been made before to people in positions of governance responsibility. So how does this report and its unique methodology and findings drive that premise?
I think what it does is it shows in more detail the high costs of not proceeding with these kinds of technologies. Is that as Robert said, we need to dig into the economic returns to them in addition to the yield, high yield impacts, but that it does demonstrate that if you don't proceed, if you don't stay in the forefront of technological change and adoption, you're going to lose very substantially, and that those regions of the world that do move forward are really going to leave you behind.
So now that you've done very well with the OECD and convinced all of them, you move on to Robert's group, and now you're talking to the farmers, the implementers. What do you say to them?
So again, a lot of that's going to be, I think, demonstrating, as Robert said, to the farmers that, okay, it looks like in this region that we're in, you're going to get, say, 20% yield increase, but does that actually apply to my farm? And you might actually even want to dig down deeper in some of the analytics to the specific soil types and so forth in those farms. But I think a lot of it is then the demonstration effect of these technologies. So that, again, you would need the equivalent of extension services, but again, it's in most countries of the world, extension services are no longer big public bureaucracies, but they're combinations of NGOs, private sector groups that are input or output companies. But you need to mobilize those to get the information out to the farmers and to get it in a more palatable way that relates directly to their own decision making.
quick comment. One of the things that farmers are really going to like about the results of this study is, if I understand it correctly, they're going to be able, through their computers, to access this grid and see how these different practices would affect their farm.
Yep.
Farmers are going to like that. They're going to like that. They're going to like, somebody's locally going to discover it in a coffee shop, start talking about it, and they're going to start playing with that. That's going to be a great tool where farmers can, digitally look at their future.
You'll be able to see that. This is the Agritech toolbox that you've got
Yeah.
outside, and there are a couple of stations. So during coffee break, after you drink your coffee, or if you're really good as you're drinking your coffee, you can do that as well. Guillaume, talk about the companies in the private sector, and we'll just do this for a couple more minutes, and then I'm going to invite you all to the microphones to interact with the panelists here. When you think about pick any of these technologies, whether it's heat, drought tolerance, nitrogen management, any of these things, these go directly to practices in the private sector, which is all about maximizing profit, right? Yeah. So do you see an impact in the near term at the private sector? And that always moves quickly, more quickly, it seems, than governance. So
It's hard to tell, but because I think some of them have already invested in this area, they are, in my view, just like any company trying to move forward faster than anybody else. So they would have done the prediction, and some of them will say, well, we need to focus on that trait or that types of seed improvement. And I know some actually companies have they've developed own software, not perhaps accounting for as many details as the IFPRI report, but looking at different types of crops and varied climates and locations so that they can see where they should focus on. So in some cases, I would say, they might already know, but in some other case, it would be a good way of showing, yes, but it's even bigger, or it's going to be in a different region, or, the return will be different from what we thought, or therefore we should put more focus on this or that. That, I think, could be something you could see. But, again, it depends on the company and the cases. But,
Mark, did you have something you wanted to jump in on that?
No, I thought that was well put. Yeah.
Okay. Either of you two have questions for the lead author of this report before I turn to the audience that you'd like to pose to him publicly and in
I have one.
drilling ways? Go ahead.
I have one that Mark might not like, but
Those are the best kind.
no. It was, there was this process a while back, a few years ago. I think it was led by the World Bank on the International Agriculture Sustainable Development. I think they were looking at technologies as well, what could work in the future sustainably. And I know that they didn't rely on the same methods on modeling or anything, and the process was very different. But it seems to me the result was also different. So I wonder if since you've been involved in both, what could you reflect on those two different processes?
Yeah, that was the so-called IAASTD, Integrated Agricultural Assessment, Science and Technology for Development. I mean, I think the issue there was that there wasn't a lot of quantitative work done. There was some review of the literature, but I think it was a more politicized process also. It tended to sort of reject out of hand any high-tech solutions and focus on the environmentally friendly solutions. But one thing I think I like about our study, we didn't set out to be that way, but instead of framing the debate, well, it's got to be the ecological or conservation technology or the high-tech breeding that's going to save the world. What I think we've shown pretty strongly here is it's not one or the other, it's both. And I think that's the advantage of this study that we have here.
Okay, let me move to questions from the audience. Who wants to lead off here? Yes, ma'am. Why don't I ask you to, and sir, may I ask you to step up to the mics, and we'll go in that direction. We'll let the ladies first. Sorry.
Thank you very much. It's extremely comprehensive study, and like someone said, we need.
It's on. I heard that go just a moment ago.
One of the biggest problem in developing country to apply technology is the infrastructure not there. And who is going to invest in the infrastructure? Because we know many scholars said if we're going to feed 1 billion hungry people, we have to go to the smallholder, and mostly in Africa. But then again, agriculture is very risky. Of course, by putting all these factors, you're mitigating a lot of risk. But who is going to put the infrastructure to assure the farmer, or the investor? And who are going to be the investor? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And in the developing world, that's going to be one of the absolute keys to getting the kind of movement we need on these technologies is rural infrastructure investment. And as simple as building roads and primary and then secondary and tertiary roads that actually get out to the farmers, that links them to markets, gets them the inputs at lower prices and get higher rates for their output. That's essential. Also essential are things like developing mobile phone tower distributions and access to risk insurance and credit. And I think that is really where the public sector comes in. And that's why I think there's a larger role for the public sector, say in Africa or South Asia than, for example, in Europe or the US or North America where that infrastructure is in place. So it really does have to be, in most cases, public sector. You might be able to find a toll road here or there that could be commissions, but almost never, I think, to get to farmers to markets. So that really is still a government role and supported, I think, necessarily by the big development banks, World Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Development Banks. So the public sector still has a big role to play in that.
Well, I think, ma'am, you really identified the heart of the problem because the population is growing in precisely those areas of the world that are already food deficient. They're already importing a lot. In fact, their food production is declining. And so Africa, Southeast Asia are going to have 8 billion people by 2050, according to this study. I have some farmers in the developed countries saying, why should we worry about trying to increase their production? We can feed them. We can't. We cannot have enough production to do that in the long term. And besides, they do need to develop more capability to feed themselves. So that depends on infrastructure and a whole cascade of things that farmers need that we take for granted here. It's just going to take money. It's going to take investment. It's going to take foreign aid from developed countries. It's going to take UN agencies that really are accountable and work in a hard way to get things done. It's not going to be easy. I think it's the challenge of our lifetime.
Robert, do you really have people who say, we don't need to worry about this and improving their productivity and we can feed the world?
Yes, but they wouldn't say it standing up in a meeting like this, but they might say it over a beer somewhere.
But I mean but the implications of that are quite serious because if you're going to have this kind of public investment, you're going to need public support for it. If people who are working with food have an attitude like that, what about the 98% of people who don't work with food? Yeah. No wonder we don't have, where's this investment going to come from if people don't understand the fundamental problems? You talked about facts. There's a big basket of them that people don't understand right there.
Well, there's quite a bit of chest beating in agriculture in North America, I think. About, we can feed the world and we're so productive. We are, and we are very productive, but we actually don't export that much to feed the rest of the world. That's a complete myth, and that's one of my little mantras to try to bring reality to that.
Guillaume, you want to comment on infrastructure and investment? No. Okay.
Yes, could you please expound a little bit on the role that you think that GMO crops are going to have to play in the future, and also the resistance that it's facing in the United States with labeling laws, in Europe, China with Syngenta crops in corn. Could you just talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The report itself is agnostic about what kinds of breeding techniques or what kinds of technology changes, techniques are required. And we focus directly on the traits like drought tolerance or heat tolerance, nitrogen use efficiency. And those can be generated either by GMO or by more conventional breeding, assisted by less controversial biotechnology techniques. As to how much of that ends up being generated by GMOs versus non-GMOs, I think it's very much depends on the incentive structures and how the science develops. So it's impossible. I've tried to think through how much of the future productivity is going to be from GMOs versus non-GMOs. There's really no way to do that now. It's just an open question still. GMOs do have the disadvantage of public acceptance issues, but I think we're moving forward in some areas, for example, in Africa, in building better biosafety regulatory systems, so that look at science-based assessments, to get away from some of the fear factor. But there's definitely, you have to think through the kinds of constraints that you talked about as well. I suspect, if I had to make a call, that there would be some significant contributions of GMOs here, but it's very difficult to say, just because of the lack of natural genetic variation to the degree to which you can generate some of these technologies. But again, that's not one of the conclusions of this report. That's a separate assessment I would make.
Let me ask you to weigh in on that question too. When you talk about regulatory divergences, that's one of the biggest.
Sure. No, there's definitely an issue. Even within OECD, there are very big differences, and we actually don't work that much on GMO at OECD because countries they realize that they have different positions. And there is some work on, harmonization of, risk assessment procedures. So the capacity, the scientific, there's a lot of work on that. Countries agree that this is a risk, this is how we should assess, which is really good. But, on the political side, there's regulatory differences, and there's perception differences, and there's countries' position differences, and it's a tricky issue. So, I think Mark summarized the position here. Whether those technologies are going to be those that really are the one leading those or not, we're not sure yet. It's difficult to say. And
do you see any movement, and do you think a report such as this
Well,
drives your priority of dealing with some of these regulatory divergences?
Since it's just agnostic, it's going into just traits rather than how you do it. I think, I'm not sure it will move forward that much. As itself, I think the debate might have moved in some European countries on whether GMO is. You see a lot of declaration of in the UK, for instance, so it's supporting this technology, which perhaps wasn't there before. But other countries don't seem to move that much on their own position. So.
They didn't eat GMO last night at the state dinner with the president of France, I don't think. Sir.
Yes, I'm Montague Dement from the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. What role do you see human capital development in science and technology in the agricultural field in developing countries playing in terms of the solution of this? One of the striking things about your report is that it's about basic agronomy. It's those skills that, to some degree have been neglected over the last 20, 30 years, both here in the United States and abroad. And the other thing that's striking is your focus on local heterogeneity. So putting together the appropriate practices, developing them, and the rate at which you can increase the effectiveness of those agronomic techniques is pretty critical to the outcome here. Thank you.
No, that's another great question. And focusing first on Africa, what you really saw in the 1980s and 90s was really a devastation of the capabilities of national research centers in that region. We have seen, fortunately, some reinvestment now in agricultural research systems in African countries. So there's finally some movement upward, but there's a long way to go. And to accomplish the kinds of things that would be needed, as you said, to get these technologies out, you do need the local expertise, so that you can get some you can bring in some expertise in foreign investment in terms of some, say, the fundamental, genes or fundamental improved varieties that are out there. But to adapt them to local conditions, you do need the skills and adaptation, not only of farmers but of the scientists themselves. So without that kind of local adaptation, you're not going to get these results. So I think that's another area where reinvestment is very much needed.
Sir, question there. And then we'll...
Hello, Jess Wilhelm, returned Peace Corps volunteer from Lesotho. My question is about the importance of small-scale farms and farmers in the context of increased importance in biotechnology, no-till. Having spent the past 2 years trying to introduce no-till to small-scale farmers in Southern Africa and knowing the challenges that can be involved in that, what is the benefit of continuing to support small-scale agriculture, or is a Brazilian model of large-scale commercialized agriculture better under this scenario, considering the important role of no-till agriculture? Thank you.
Great question.
Yeah, I don't know the specific conditions you were working in Jess. I think in parts of South Asia, no-till has advanced relatively quickly under small farms. So I suspect you're going to see it, you've seen it already in Asia, at least increasing in at least the operation size of farms, so that oftentimes ownership is still in very small units, but you are seeing leasing out of land, and then adoption of technologies. So some of these technologies probably will sort of co-evolve with that kind of gradual increase in at least the farm operational size, if not the actual ownership size. So I think you are going to see some of that.
Robert?
Well, I think that you ask a good question, but I think the answer is we have to find a way for the smallholder farmers to prosper and be more productive, because the social implications of doing Brazilian-style agriculture are just going to lead to worse problems. And I'm thinking of a number of countries that have leased large acreages of land, or attempted to in Africa and other places, because they're concerned about the future food security of their fairly well-off country. For example, one example that I think has been in the press quite a bit was a South Korean corporation, I think it was Daewoo, leased half the land in Madagascar. I think it was a $6 billion lease. It occasioned such public outcry in Madagascar that they overthrew the government. So I don't think that is a good alternative. You think about throwing people off the land to make way for some foreign type of agricultural operation. I think that's a recipe for civil unrest, to say the least. So I think we have to find a way to engage smallholders. And there's been a lot of work done to do that. There's been a lot of failures. There's no doubt about that. I'm not responding specifically to your no-till question, but just in general, trying to improve production. I think that we're getting to be better at figuring out what people need, and I think the best thing we're doing lately is in those local communities, we're asking smallholders, what do you need? What do you need to improve production? And I think that's helping. We also need to let them get them to make an investment in this change as well, so they feel some ownership with it. I mean, you can't just do things for people and then build some sort of institution, a fertilizer plant, for example, and then leave unless they've understood how to operate it. So I don't claim to have the answers, but surely just a rather forceful eviction of people to bring in large-scale agriculture, I think would be disastrous.
What was your experience working with those farmers with no-till? I'm just sort of curious, since we're having this discussion and no-till is so prominent on these technologies, what you actually saw and lived.
In my experience, the older the farmer and the male farmers were more resistant to adoption of it, because farming for them was less of a livelihood and more of a cultural practice involving cattle and involving status. Women, widows, and younger farmers were more willing to adopt changes. They're more open-minded to using chemical weed control versus tillage. And we had a few successes here and there. I'd say 20% of the people I worked with tried it once. It's been a half year. I guess I could call some people and see if they're still sticking with it.
20%
Yes.
tried it.
Tried it.
Never mind, stayed with it.
Yes.
And
So-
you found that older guys were less open to change.
Sometimes that happens.
That somehow may not be cultural.
It's impossible to believe.
I think that might carry over outside of the African context.
Yeah, yes. Thank you. That's fascinating. Do we have another question here? Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
I come from Ethiopia. I'm from the University of Addis Ababa. From the presentation, I didn't have the chance to read the book. I found quite interesting in the sense that when they try to diffuse technologies in Ethiopia, there are always champions, individuals who come with a PhD in this area and that area, and they say, this is the best. So everybody tries to do that, and then somebody else comes after 2 years and then says, oh, this is a better one. So things change without, but this one has given us, certain criteria for at least saying this is probably better for this and that. And then it's also that you can disaggregate it at lower levels. That's something that is an advantage. But I have two basic problems. One is, in places like Ethiopia, I'm not talking about the US farmers or whatever, how is it possible to, what would be the best way of organizing the diffusion of such things? We have had extension.
The best way of?
We have had extension, best way of organizing the dissemination of such things. Because we have had experiences of extension programs, whatever, for the past 40, 50 years in these countries, and yet none seem to have, picked up things. The small things start, then they fail. There is no consistency in terms of, building and going on. Why? Because the farmers maybe have not accepted them. Why haven't they accepted them? Because they have a tradition, they have a way of doing things, their things themselves. And we don't study those and try to improve on them. We simply say, we have something good here, just copy it and do it. And that seems to be a problem. Another issue I have is, what are the costs of this whole thing? We are looking at whatever the cost is. Let's have production of wheat increased by 20%, 30%. What are the costs involved? If we don't know that, then the 10% elsewhere could be better. So is there any study in terms of looking at the costs of adapting those technologies? The other thing, probably two technologies that have been forgotten or could be included in future studies. One is the waste of output that has already been produced. It's produced, taken home, and it's lost. There is quite a large proportion of that. Secondly, is the loss of food from processing itself. In households, in small holding farms, the loss of food in terms of in the process of processing the food itself is quite large, could be large. That could also be parts that could be included. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You put a lot on the table, if I can use that term. Mark, let me let you lead it off.
Yeah, I think, those are really great points. I mean, in Ethiopia, for example, as you know, was it 5 to 6 years ago, there was this huge promotion of maize, the new maize varieties and so forth. They were adopted extremely high, broadly, very high yields and production. But then unfortunately, there's no market for it, and they weren't able to export as well. So that set back that kind of the maize production systems dramatically. So you do have to, come into any specific country context and look not only at the technologies that are being proposed here, but the environment in which they would be grown. I think one good thing, we can actually zero in on Ethiopia and sub-regions within Ethiopia with this analysis, and some of that could be seen in the tool, others could be in additional analysis. But as you said, you have to look at these other constraints as well, not just say, okay, let's just do it. And so it does have to be balanced. The post-harvest losses, that's a very interesting question. In fact, we're starting to do some analysis now. We're trying to look at, there's really a huge debate now. How big are those, and can they be economically or reduced? And we are starting some work to try to contribute to that debate, to look at the specific investments that could reduce losses, and what's the cost effectiveness of those as well. So we are trying to deal with that as well.
Mark, why wasn't food loss one of the technologies? That's not a technology per se, but
yeah, it really would have taken a different analysis than what we did here. But I think it's very important. But yes, we are trying to start digging into it. The data is actually pretty weak there. The numbers that you see of 50, wasting 50, 80%. I doubt those very much. There's now a whole set of farm-level studies that are showing much lower levels from farm and then tracing through the value chain. So there has to get some real agreement on those numbers, but then also to look very carefully at those post-harvest technologies and which ones can cost-effectively reduce some of the losses.
Okay, before we wrap up here and we release you to your coffee break, I'd just like to ask each of you to sort of provide us with a concluding thought. And I'd like to frame it up this way, because when we did our focus on food, our year of food, through this Planet Forward project that we've got over at the university, we tried to frame the conversation around innovations in food production. Innovations. And as a storyteller, I find innovations fascinating because they take you, by definition, someplace new. They introduce new ideas, and if they can be disseminated through, compelling case studies, like you're going to make more money for doing this, they catch on. In thinking about these technologies and this regional challenge that you lay out in this report, Mark, and in thinking about the constituencies that you're each working with, is there an innovation that you can cite, an example, that underscores some of the findings here or some of the implicit recommendations, or that comes to mind that would do that? In other words, give us an example. Take us someplace where you find something. Take the no-till example, for example, where you could go from 20% to 40% because something really remarkable has been done in an innovative way of presenting it or doing it or showing the results of it.
I guess let me go on sort of the other side, the high-tech side of what we're studying. That, as I mentioned, you say even 10 years ago, you talk to people, you say, developing countries are never going to do precision agriculture. But we've already seen some significant evolution of that in parts of India, parts of Southeast Asia, and they're doing it in ways without the really high-tech tractors that you find here in the U.S. But smaller scale tractors, but they have the basics of the GPS there. They're doing innovative contractual arrangements. So for example, there's people. One entrepreneur will buy a small laser land leveling machine and then hire out sequentially to the smaller farmers around the area. So that they're adopting technology that you've seen in, say, North America or Brazil to their own labor and capital situations and moving forward on that. And so I think that's the kind of thing that's, to me, very encouraging, that there is that kind of adaptation taking place.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to think about the specific innovation that I would give my
Because you work at OECD?
Yeah,
or?
it's a little different. Yeah, exactly. Well, I used to work at IFPRI, so I know both sides in a way. But no. But I think something that gets out of this report is, this idea of combination of technologies that is interesting as well. I didn't really talk about that in the presentation, and Mark mentioned that quite a few times. But going into a different direction at the same time is something you should strive on, because it seems that you can't just go. I mean, at least in the OECD part, there's that it's not only yield, but we have to look more carefully at water. We have to look at what's happening with the climate. We have to look at the land use. We have to use that nitrogen, even phosphorus, other types of. If we can get into this sort of multi-pronged approach on technology, maybe we can sell better this idea that it's not white or black, or we should just go all in one way or on the other. We really need to have some kind of a mosaic of technologies here and there, and this kind of reports and disaggregation by pixel would help to show.
That would be a better and different way of going about it.
I think so. Yeah.
Robert?
Well, certainly in the farm community, the most appealing program you can put on these days to get a group of farmers together is on precision agriculture, no question about it, especially younger farmers.
And when you say in the agriculture, is that in North America or worldwide?
Well, my experience in that would be North America. It may be worldwide among farmers that have the capacity to adopt that technology. So I would guess that would be the case in Europe as well. The thing that really, or the part of precision ag that really seems to be taking off is the precision fertilizer placement, variable rate fertilizer placement, depending on what the land needs, and that saves the farmer some money, even though it requires an initial investment, which they can get around by hiring somebody to do it as well, the co-op or somebody who's doing it commercially. And then it has the real benefit as well of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in that case nitrous oxide, which is one of the really bad greenhouse gases. Some of the other new technologies have been around, or so-called new technology, I shouldn't say new, the technologies the report talks about have been around for a while and just need some time to work. I know Mark talked about no-till. We know university studies show that no-till, even in the Corn Belt, would be effective if you give the ground several years to become more, have more humus in it. And but farmers don't seem, on the whole, to be willing to allow that time period to elapse. So maybe in the future, as the climate changes a bit, that will become more common. But right now, there's this real feeling that we need to get in and seed early and get the crop off as early as we can, and so we don't want to no-till. But I think the precision agriculture is the coming thing. That won't mean much to consumers, but it does to farmers.
We had a wonderful exchange with one of the farmers who came to one of our gatherings, and he told us how he sat in CAD with his vehicle, his combine, and did crossword puzzles while his while his precision agriculture worked magic beneath him. Mark, you and your team have put in huge amount of work into this report, and you've presented it here, and we've had this conversation. I wonder if you have a sort of concluding thought before we head to coffee break.
Well, again, I think just the emphasis that we can't just pick one way forward. That there's no silver bullet, no magic technologies. That we really have to. There has to be strong investment and innovation across a very wide range of technologies.
That's great. All right, we'll take a 15-minute break. I do want to point out the Agritech toolbox. There are 3 stations out there. You can try those and plug some of these coordinates in. Grab a cup of coffee, and then we'll come back and have our second panel. And thanks to our panelists and presenters and Mark on the report.